In the autumn of 1868, two men cutting timber along a ridge above the White River discovered a girl standing perfectly motionless at the edge of a dry creek bed. She appeared no older than 9. Her feet were bare and blackened. Her dress had been sewn from a coarse gray cloth that neither man recognized, stitched in tight spirals that ran across the chest like the rings of a cut tree. When they approached, she did not flee, nor did she weep. She looked up at the two grown men with their axes and asked them a single question that stopped both of them cold where they stood. She wanted to know whether the tall people had finally sent someone for her. Neither man understood what she meant. They only understood that a child had been living somewhere in those woods, alone, long enough to forget that other people did not live the way she had learned to live. What she revealed to them over the following 3 weeks was recorded by a county recorder who did not believe a word of it. That record still survives, and what it describes does not match any history you were ever taught about that region. The men who found her were named Aldous Prime and his brother-in-law, a quiet Norwegian everyone called Sten. They had been clearing a stand of oak on land that did not belong to them, which is the only reason anyone was up on that ridge at all. Nobody farmed it. Nobody grazed it. The locals had a habit of walking the long way around the base of that hill. And when you asked them why, they gave you the kind of answer that is really no answer. They said the ground up there did not hold seed. The game trails, they said, all bent away from the summit instead of crossing it. They said their fathers had told them to leave it be. The girl let the men lead her down the slope without any resistance, but she stopped twice on the way. At the first stop, she crouched and pressed her palm flat against a slab of pale rock that jutted out from the hillside, holding it there with her eyes closed, as if she were listening to it. The second time she stopped at the tree line, where the woods gave way to open pasture, and she refused to step past it. Sten had to carry her across. He later said that the moment her body crossed out from under the last branches, she went rigid in his arms and stared back over his shoulder at the woods for a long time, the way a person stares at a house they are being taken away from. They brought her to the nearest homestead, a 2-room place kept by a widow named Martha Halverson. Martha had buried 2 children of her own, and she took the girl in without asking permission from anyone. And it was inside that farmhouse over those first strange days that the widow began to notice the things the girl did when she thought no one was watching. She would not eat anything cooked over an open flame. She poured a thin line of salt along every windowsill each night before dark and grew frantic if it was disturbed. And she counted under her breath at the same 2 moments of every day, once when the light came and once when it left. She counted quietly up to a number and then started again. Martha noticed other things as the days went on. The girl never spoke above a low, even murmur, as though a loud sound might be heard by something she did not want to attract. She flinched from the ticking of the widow's mantel clock and finally asked, in her few broken words, for it to be stopped, because it counted wrong. She slept in the daylight hours and lay awake through the dark with her eyes open, watching the window. And when Martha sat up one night to keep her company, the girl reached over and took the widow's hand, not for comfort, but to press it flat against the sill beside the line of salt. The way you might teach a younger child to hold still and feel a heartbeat. And before we go further, I need to pause for a moment, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker. And I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of what that girl described in the woods, the words she used for the tall figures, the marks she scratched into the Halverson table, the county recorder's transcript of her statement copied down line for line. I put it all into a written document. It's linked below and the QR code is on your screen. Now, let's continue. The recorder was a man named Josiah Feld, and he came out to the Halverson place because that was his job. To write down anything that might matter to a claim, a debt, or a court. A found child mattered. Somewhere there might be a family, a grave, a piece of land. So Feld sat at Martyr's table with his ledger and asked the girl the ordinary questions. Her name, her age, where her people were. And the answers he wrote down are the reason his ledger was quietly removed from the county office within the year and never entered into any public record. She gave no name that Feld could spell. When he pressed her, she said the tall people had taken her name when she was small and kept it somewhere safe, and that she would get it back when she was old enough to be counted. She did not know her age in years. Her life was measured in something else. She told Feld she had lived through the counting many times, and when he asked what the counting was, she explained it the way a child explains something so obvious to them that they cannot understand why an adult would ask. The people in the woods, she said, were very tall and very thin, and they did not walk so much as arrive. They came at the two soft edges of the day, at first light and at last light. And they went along the trees, touching each trunk in turn. And they counted them. Every tree had to be there. If a tree fell in a storm, the tall people stood at the empty place for a long time, and the girl said the woods felt wrong for days afterward. The way a mouth feels wrong after a tooth comes out. They were not counting to know how many trees there were. She was very clear about this. They were counting to hold the woods in place. She believed in the plain way that children believe the things they are raised inside of, that if the tall people ever stopped counting, the woods would forget how to exist. That is why she counted. She had learned it from them. She counted the walls of the farmhouse, the panes in the window, the plates on the shelf, because she had been taught that things which are not counted slip loose, and the salt on the window sills was the same lesson turned inward. The tall people did not cross salt. She did not fully know why. She only knew that the one time she had spilled her salt as a small child, something had come to the low opening of the shelter. She slept in and crouched there in the dark, breathing until first light, and had never quite left her since. There was an order to the way the tall people moved, and the girl described it with the flat precision of someone reciting a chore she had done 10,000 times. They never hurried. They never gathered together. Each one kept to its own stretch of the woods, its own rows of trees, and they did not seem to speak to one another. Or if they did, it was in the long silences between the counting. In a way, she could feel more than hear, like the pressure that comes into the air before a storm that never quite breaks. She said their faces were smooth, and their eyes were set too far apart, and did not blink at the soft edges of the day when the counting was on them. And she said that once, when she was very small, she had followed one of them too closely out of loneliness, and it had turned and looked down at her. And it had not been angry, it had been sorry. She never forgot that. Of everything she told Feld, the detail he found hardest to set aside was that a child alone in the wilderness had come away, not frightened of the things she lived among, but grieving for them. The counting had a shape to it that she could not fully explain, but could not stop performing. It rose and fell. Some numbers were heavy and had to be said slowly, and some were light and could be passed over quickly. And there were certain numbers she would not say aloud at all, that she skipped with a small catch in her breath, because those were the numbers where the tall people always stopped and stood still and seemed to listen. When Feld asked what they were listening for, the girl went quiet for a long while, and then she said the one thing in the entire account that she refused to explain any further. She said they were listening to hear whether the owner was coming back. And she would not say who the owner was or how she knew there was one. Only that the tall people had been waiting so long that the waiting had become the whole of what they were, and that she thought waiting that long could hollow a thing out until nothing was left inside it. But the listening, she told him the woods were not silent the way ordinary woods are silent. There was always a sound under everything, so low and so constant that after a while you stopped hearing it as a sound and felt it instead as the shape of the day. It was the counting. It never fully stopped because the tall people traded it back and forth across the ridge, one taking it up as another set it down, so that in all her years she had never once heard the woods go quiet. Feld wrote all of this down. He was a practical man, and he assumed he was recording the fantasies of a traumatized child who had survived alone in the wilderness by inventing companions. But then the girl described something that a lost child could not have invented, because it was not the kind of thing a child imagines. It was the kind of thing a witness reports. Before we move on to what the search party found on the ridgetop, for a second, what you just heard about the counting and the salt is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the recorder's full account. The salt lines, the counting at dusk, it's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. The QR code is on your screen. She described the buildings. Not shelters, not lean-tos, not the kind of thing a wild child might cobble together. She told Feld that deep in the woods, past the ridge, there were old walls, straight walls of pale-cut stone, taller than any man, standing in long lines that the trees had grown up around and through. She said the tall people did not build them. She said the tall people lived among them the way she lived in the Halverson house, as tenants of something that had been made by someone else long before and abandoned. There were doorways in the walls with no doors and windows with no glass, and the tall people never went inside. Instead, they only tended the outside, sweeping the thresholds and clearing the roots, counting the stones the way they counted the trees. And the girl said one thing that Feld underlined twice in his ledger, which was not his habit. She said the tall people were afraid. All of that counting, all of that tending, all of that holding the woods in place. It was not the behavior of masters. It was the behavior of servants who had been left in charge of something and told never to let it end by an owner who had gone away and never come back. The tall people were caretakers, and a caretaker, she seemed to understand better than any adult who later read her words, is only ever the memory of the person who left. Feld asked her the obvious question. How did she come to be with them? And her answer is the part of the account that historians of the region cannot fit anywhere. She said she was not the first. There had always been a child in the woods with the tall people, one at a time, she said, and the child's task was to be the one small thing that grew and changed while everything else was held perfectly still. She was, in her own words, the clock. The tall people counted to keep the woods from slipping. But a woods that never changes is a woods that is already dead, and something in them knew that. So they kept a child. They let one thing age. And when that child grew too old to be a child, the child left the woods, walked out into the country of ordinary people, and a new small one was brought in from somewhere to begin again. She did not know where the new ones came from. She had been the small one for as long as she could remember. And she believed, sitting at that farmhouse table, that the reason she had been allowed to walk out of the woods and be found by Aldous Prime was not luck, and not escape. She believed she had simply gotten too old. She had aged out. The tall people had let her go the way you release something you can no longer use. And somewhere behind her, in the dark past the ridge, a smaller child had already taken her place at the low opening, learning to count, learning the salt. This is where the story stops being the account of one strange girl and starts being something that should not be possible, because a party of men from the valley decided to go up the ridge and see for themselves. Aldous Prime led them. There were 6 in all, carrying rifles and lanterns in the flat certainty of grown men who have decided that a child's story is a child's story. They went up in the middle of the day, avoiding the 2 soft edges the girl had warned them about. And what they found is recorded in a second document. A letter Prime dictated years later to a preacher, who took it down and kept it. They found the walls. Long lines of pale-cut stone standing among the oaks, exactly where the girl had said they would be, taller than a man. So old that trees 100 years grown had split them and healed around them. The men had lived in that country their whole lives. Their fathers had lived there, and not one of them had ever heard of stone buildings on that ridge, because the trail bent away from the summit. And the people bent away with it generation after generation until the not knowing was so complete that it felt like the walls had never been there at all. Prime wrote that the strangest thing was not finding the walls. The strangest thing was realizing how hard everyone had worked, without ever deciding to make sure no one climbed up and did. They did not find the tall people. It was the middle of the day, and if the girl was to be believed, the tall people only came at the edges. But they found the low opening where she had slept. A gap at the base of one wall lined with dry grass, and beside it a shallow bowl of salt. And around the largest of the buildings they found the countings, small marks cut into the stone, at the height of a tall, reaching arm. Thousands of them in long, even rows, tallying something no one could read. Prime wrote that as they stood there in the daylight, one of the younger men began, without meaning to count the marks under his breath. And Prime made him stop. He did not fully know why he made him stop. He only knew, standing among those walls, that some habits are catching, and that the counting wanted to be picked up and carried on, and that a man could walk down off that ridge, already holding it. They left before the light started to go. They did not go back. And within a decade, the timber company that owned the land on paper let it go for unpaid taxes, and it passed to a railroad. And the railroad surveyed everything around it, and drew a clean blank space over the ridge itself, and no line was ever run across it. The blank space is still on some of the old maps, if you know how to read them. A shape of nothing in the middle of country that was otherwise measured down to the acre. The girl did not stay in the valley. Martyr Halverson kept her for almost a year, and the widow's own account. The third piece of this is the gentlest and the worst. Martyr wrote that the child slowly learned to eat cooked food, learned a few dozen words of ordinary speech, learned to sleep through a night. She was, by every outward sign, becoming a normal girl. But the counting never fully stopped. Martyr would wake before dawn and find her at the window in the gray light, lips moving, tallying the panes. And when Martyr asked her once gently why, she still did it after all this time. The girl looked at her with something close to pity and said that someone had to. She said the tall people were very far away now, and could not reach this house. And that meant the counting here was hers to keep. She had not escaped the task. The task had come out of the woods with her. She died in the spring of a fever that went through the valley and took several of the weaker children with it. Martyr buried her at the edge of the property under a stone with no name on it, because no one had ever learned a name to carve. And Martyr wrote one last line that has troubled everyone who has read her account since. She wrote that on the night the girl died, for the first time in almost a year, the salt on the windowsills was gone. It had not spilled, and it had not scattered. It was simply gone, as if it had been gathered up and taken. And Martyr wrote that she did not sleep that night, because somewhere out past the pasture, out past the tree line the girl had never once been willing to cross again. She was certain she could hear, very faint and very patient, the sound of something being counted. Here is what the 3 documents taken together actually describe. Not a ghost story, not a lost child's fantasy. They describe one place that was built by someone we have no record of, and then abandoned. They describe a population of caretakers, left behind to hold that place in a kind of frozen present, terrified of change, counting the world to keep it from slipping. And they describe a mechanism, a single aging child passed down across untold years. That suggests this had been going on for a very long time before a girl in a spiral, stitched dress walked out of the woods in 1868 and told a county recorder that she had simply gotten too old. Think about what that means for a moment. Not the ghost of a girl and not the campfire shape of a monster, but a structure, a system with a purpose running unattended for so long that the ones who ran it had forgotten. There was ever supposed to be an end to it. The tall people were not the mystery. The tall people were the answer to a mystery. The living proof that someone, at some point, on a ridge in the middle of ordinary American country, had built something in stone that mattered enough to leave guardians behind, and then had gone so completely that we do not even have a name for who they were. You will not find the ridge named on a modern map. You will not find Josiah Feld's ledger in the county records, because it was removed. What you will find if you go looking through the oldest survey documents of that part of the Ozarks is the blank space. The shape of nothing. The one piece of ground that everyone, for generation after generation, agreed without ever discussing it to leave uncounted. And maybe that was the safest thing to do, because the girl believed that counting held the woods in place. But she never once claimed it was the woods that needed holding. She only ever said that the tall people were afraid of what would happen if they stopped. And she never told anyone what they were afraid would begin